I had the apology memorized. Every syllable calibrated for humility. 60 years of diplomatic protocol had given humanity a very specific voice in the Galactic Council. Quiet, measured, always slightly smaller than the room required. I had spent 22 years perfecting that voice. I had given it to committees, arbiters, senior delegates, and species whose names I could not pronounce without rehearsing them the night before. I had given it in exchange for permission. Permission to exist in their halls. Permission to be heard for exactly the number of minutes they allowed. And I had always believed, the way my father had believed before me, that one day the giving would stop. That one day we would have given enough. Arbiter Voss read Edict 7 Theta at exactly 9 in the morning, Council Standard Time. His voice carried no emotion. It never did. He was a Veth, tall and angular, with pale gray skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and eyes the color of deep water. He had been an arbiter for longer than any living human had been alive, and he had the manner of someone who had long ago stopped thinking of his decisions as decisions at all. They were simply announcements. The universe would arrange itself accordingly. I sat in the human delegation seat, one seat, on the outer ring of the chamber, without a vote, without the right to formally object, with only the right to listen and then speak when spoken to. The chamber itself was enormous. It rose in concentric tiers, each row filled with representatives from species I had studied for years. The Keth, with their layered vocal cords, the Saran with their bioluminescent markings, the hulking Dravi who communicated partly through ground vibrations their translators converted to words. Hundreds of beings, one room, one voice speaking, and that voice was Voss, and what he was saying was this. Humanity was to decommission 80% of its defense fleet within 18 months. Humanity was to surrender the colony of New Carthage, which the Council had retroactively designated a protected spiritual site of the Marin people, a designation that had not existed 4 months ago, when we signed the colonization charter. Humanity was to pay reparations amounting to 11 years of our total economic output, for the insult of having colonized land we had every right to colonize. And humanity was to do all of this as a gesture of goodwill, or face formal censure and removal from its observer seat. I held the prepared speech in my hands. It was printed on actual paper, an old habit from my father, who said that holding words in your hands made them feel more real. I could feel the edges of the pages. I had written this apology myself. I had been careful with every word. I had acknowledged the sacred nature of Marin cultural heritage. I had expressed humanity's deep regret. I had used the phrase, in the spirit of galactic unity, 4 times, because 4 was apparently the number that read as sufficiently sincere without tipping into excess. Voss finished reading. He set down the document. He looked at me, the way one looks at a piece of furniture one expects to move on its own. Commander Varen, he said, you may respond. I stood up. I had been sitting in this chair, or chairs exactly like it, for 22 years. I had stood up in exactly this way hundreds of times. My legs knew the motion. My spine knew the posture. Straight but not rigid. Confident but not presumptuous. My mouth knew how to open. My voice knew how to begin. I looked down at the paper in my hands. I looked up at Arbiter Voss. And then I set the paper down on the desk in front of me. I set it down very carefully, the way you set something down when you are certain you will not be picking it up again. The chamber was already quiet, but it became a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when something unexpected enters a room. I did not speak. I did not apologize. I did not acknowledge the edict. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I put it on. I looked at Voss one more time, not with anger, not with defiance, simply with the steady, level look of someone who has just made a decision that cannot be unmade. And I walked toward the exit. No one stopped me. I think they were too surprised to stop me. In 800 years of Galactic Council proceedings, no delegate had simply walked out. There were protocols for objection. There were formal procedures for dissent. There were 17 different categories of diplomatic grievance, each with its own required form and its own required timeline. There was no category for this. There was no form for a human diplomat setting down her prepared apology, putting on her jacket, and leaving without a word. The door closed behind me. I walked down the long corridor outside the chamber. past the crystalline walls of Nexara Prime's council complex, past the alien attendants who stopped and stared, past the security checkpoint where a Dravi officer half rose from his seat before deciding, correctly, that I was not a threat and that whatever was happening was above his clearance level. I walked to the transit bay. I boarded the shuttle to the orbital station. I sat in my seat. I watched Nexara Prime grow small through the window. I had no idea what I had just done. That is not entirely true. I knew exactly what I had done. What I did not know was what would come next, because nothing in 22 years of training had prepared me for a next that began this way. Every scenario I had ever studied, every diplomatic simulation, every crisis model assumed that humans would stay in the room. Staying in the room was the entire strategy. My father had stayed in the room through worse than this. He had smiled through the Aldori Exclusion Act, which banned human vessels from 17 star systems for 5 years. He had nodded through the Harvest Compact revisions, which cut Earth's permitted agricultural trade by 40%. He had shaken hands and signed documents and said, quietly and firmly and with great personal dignity, that he understood, that he accepted, that humanity would comply. He had told me, near the end of his life, that it would get better, that patience was a form of strength, that the Council would eventually see humanity's value and adjust accordingly. He had been wrong, or perhaps he had not lived long enough to be right. I was no longer sure which. The shuttle docked with the human carrier ship Meridian, and I went directly to the communications room. Admiral Len Carter was already on screen when I entered. Someone had clearly relayed what happened before I arrived. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, with close-cropped white hair, and the permanently calm expression of someone who had been in enough genuine emergencies to know the difference between a crisis and a turning point. He looked at me for a long moment. "Tell me you have a plan," he said. "Send a message to Earth," I said. "To the Secretary, to the Council of Ministers, to every department head with clearance. The message is 2 words." He waited. "No more," I said. Carter looked at me. Then he looked at the communications officer beside him. Then he looked back at me. "And after that?" he said. "After that," I said, "we say nothing." He was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he gave one slow, deliberate nod. The kind of nod that meant he had been waiting for this too, had perhaps been waiting for years, and was simply relieved that someone had finally said it out loud. "Send it," he said to the communications officer. The message went out at 0947, Council Standard Time. It was the last official communication the Galactic Council received from humanity for 14 months. I went to my quarters on the Meridian, and sat on the edge of the bunk, and held my hands in my lap, and thought about my father. He had a particular way of walking into a room, shoulders back, chin level, eyes already finding the person he needed to speak to. He had looked like a man who belonged everywhere he went, but I had watched him, over the years, practice that walk. I had seen him in the mornings, before the meetings, standing in front of the mirror and composing himself. Not the walk of a man who naturally belonged, the walk of a man who had decided, every single day, to behave as if he did, because the alternative was to disappear entirely. I did not know, sitting on that bunk, whether I had done something brave or something reckless. I did not know whether history would call this a turning point or a disaster. I knew only that when Voss had looked at me across that chamber, with that particular expression of complete and total certainty that I would do exactly what I was expected to do, something in me had refused. Quietly, without anger, simply and completely refused. The Meridian hummed around me. Outside, through the porthole, the stars held their positions with the patience of things that had been there long before the Galactic Council, and would be there long after. I lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in 22 years, I did not have an apology to prepare. It was the strangest feeling I had ever had. It took me several minutes to recognize it as relief. The first hail from the Council came at 11:03, less than 2 hours after I left the chamber. It was addressed to Commander Asha Varen, Human Delegation, and marked urgent. Our communications officer, a young woman named Nina Holt, logged it and set it aside. The second hail came 40 minutes later, from a different Council office. The third came directly from Arbiter Voss's personal channel. We logged them all. We answered none of them. By the end of the first day, there were 11 unanswered hails. By the end of the first week, there were 43. The council sent a formal diplomatic courier, a physical ship, crewed by a Saran officer and 2 Keth aides, to intercept the Meridian in transit. We received their docking request, acknowledged it, and then altered course to a different sector without explanation. They could not legally follow us. We were not in violation of any treaty, because we had not formally withdrawn from any treaty. We had simply stopped talking, and stopping talking, it turned out, was not something the council had ever thought to write a rule against. Nina knocked on my door on the 3rd day, and stood in the doorway with her tablet held at her side, and a look on her face that fell somewhere between admiration and genuine concern. 43 hails, she said, and counting. I know, I said. They're going to escalate, she said. I know that too, I said. She nodded slowly. I just wanted to make sure you were sleeping. I was not sleeping particularly well, but I thanked her and told her I was fine, because some things a commander keeps to herself. After she left, I sat at the small desk in my quarters and opened the private message thread that had been building between me, Admiral Carter, and Secretary Yara Osei back on Earth. Osei had been appointed Secretary of Interplanetary Affairs 3 years ago, and she was possibly the sharpest person I had ever had a conversation with. She had a gift for seeing the architecture of a situation, not just the immediate problem, but the structure that produced the problem, and the structure beneath that. When I had first explained what I had done in the council chamber, she had gone very quiet for a long time, long enough that I had started to wonder if the connection had dropped. Then she had said, "Walk me through what you think happens next." I had walked her through it. She had asked questions, precise, targeted questions that made me clarify things I had only been thinking in rough outlines. She had not praised what I had done. She had not criticized it either. She had simply helped me build it into something with actual shape. The strategy, such as it was, came down to one core observation. The council had spent 60 years treating human compliance as a guaranteed resource. They had built policy on it, structured agreements around it, made assumptions about it the way you make assumptions about gravity. You do not prepare for gravity to stop. You do not have a protocol for it. It simply is. We were going to make gravity stop. Not with a fleet, not with threats, not with any of the 12 scenarios the Council's Security Division had presumably modeled for human aggression. We were going to do it by becoming unreachable, by removing ourselves from the equation entirely, and waiting to see how the equation looked without us. The problem with this plan was that it required an enormous amount of nerve, and very little evidence that it would work. We were a junior species with 1 non-voting seat. The Council had 800 years of institutional weight behind it. We had walked out of a meeting. But then Osei had sent me something that changed the way I was looking at it. It was a compiled analysis from our intelligence division, 6 months of data on which species relied most heavily on human-derived technology, human medical supplies, human engineering contractors, and human-piloted logistics routes. It covered 31 council member species. The number of those 31 who had 0 significant dependency on something humanity produced was 4. 4 out of 31. The council had spent 60 years making us smaller in the room, while quietly, without ever acknowledging it, growing dependent on what we made outside the room. They had leaned on us the way you lean on a wall, without ever looking at the wall, without ever considering what happened to the lean when the wall moved. I read that analysis 3 times. Then I sent a short message back to Osei. I think we need to stay silent longer than anyone is going to be comfortable with. She replied within the hour. Agreed. Hold the line. On day 8, the Council issued a formal statement declaring humanity's silence an act of diplomatic hostility. They announced that humanity's observer status was under review, and that a formal proceeding would be opened within 30 days. We did not respond to this either. On day 11, a Keth ship requested a non-official channel with the Meridian. Not a council communication. A private one. The request came flagged as personal, from an individual named Tessavar, who identified herself as a junior cultural liaison at the Keth Assembly. I had never spoken to her. I had never heard of her. I accepted the call. Tessavar was small even by Keth standards, with the layered voice characteristic of her species. When she spoke, there was always a faint harmonic underneath her words, like a melody running beneath spoken language. She looked at me on screen for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in careful, precise standard common, "We have been watching what you are doing." "All right," I said. "There are species in this council," she said, "who have wanted to do what you are doing for a very long time, who did not believe it was possible." She paused. "Who did not believe they were allowed." I kept my face neutral. "What made you contact us?" She looked at something off screen, as if checking that she was alone, then back at me. "Because you did it," she said simply. "You simply did it, and nothing has exploded." I thought about my father standing in front of his mirror, practicing belonging. "Not yet," I said honestly. Tessivar made a sound that might have been the Keth equivalent of a small, careful laugh. "No," she agreed. "Not yet." The call lasted 9 minutes. She did not make any promises. She did not offer alliance or formal support. But when it ended, I sat for a long time in the communications room and thought about what she had said. You simply did it, and nothing has exploded. The council had built its authority on the assumption that defiance led to explosion. That was the lesson they taught, the history they cited, the consequence they implied every time a smaller species considered pushing back. But I had walked out of a room, and the stars were still in their places. The meridian was still flying. Earth was still turning. On day 15, I received a message from Admiral Carter. He had been in contact with the Joint Military Command back home. The message was brief and carried a weight that made me read it twice. "The Prometheus-class ships are coming out of dry dock," he wrote, quietly, no announcements, just maintenance schedules and personnel transfers. "They'll be flight-ready in 4 months." The Prometheus-class fleet had been in dry dock for nearly a decade, held in voluntary suspension as a gesture of good faith under the 4th round of Council human arms negotiations. We had built them, paid for them, crewed them in theory, and then parked them in stillness because the Council had requested it as a condition of our continued observer status. They were extraordinary ships, not aggressive, not designed for conquest, but powerful in the straightforward sense of the word, designed to protect human space with a capability that had made several Council members visibly uncomfortable during the original negotiations. They had been sitting in the dark for 9 years. I wrote back to Carter, "No announcements, just fly them." He replied with a single word, "Understood." Outside my porthole, the stars continued to hold their positions, patient, indifferent, old beyond any species' ability to truly comprehend. I turned back to the growing list of unanswered hails on my screen and felt, for the second time in 2 weeks, the strange and unfamiliar sensation of not being afraid of what came next. It was an odd thing, that feeling. I kept expecting it to go away. It kept not going away. The Council wanted negotiations. They wanted humanity back in the room, back in the chair, back with the prepared speech, and the 4 uses of galactic unity, and the quiet, careful voice of a species that had decided it needed to be smaller than it was. They were going to keep waiting. Because the ship was flying, the fleet was waking up, and somewhere on New Carthage, 12 million people were planting gardens and building schools and expanding the Port Authority without a single council form to fill out. And not one of them had thought to apologize for it. We had been small for 60 years. We were done being small. 9 months passed before anyone from the Galactic Council physically set foot in human-controlled space. And by then, the space had changed enough that they would not have recognized it 3 seasons ago. New Carthage was the clearest example. When the Council had issued Edict 7 Theta, the colony was home to roughly 400,000 people, mostly engineers and agricultural specialists, living in a settlement that was by any measure functional, but that had always carried the slightly provisional quality of a place waiting for permission to become permanent. The permission had never come, because the Council had never given it, and the colony had existed in a state of careful, bounded development. No major infrastructure investment, no secondary settlements, nothing that might look too much like the colonists planning to stay. That restraint ended the morning I walked out of the chamber on Nexera Prime. Secretary Osei had put the authorization through within 36 hours of my message. No more size limits on development. No more waiting on council approval for resource extraction permits. No more voluntary communication restrictions on colonial shipping lanes. The infrastructure budget that had been sitting in a reserve account for 7 years untouched because spending it would have technically exceeded the Council's informal guidelines on colonial investment, was released in its entirety. New Carthage erupted. I say that with warmth, not alarm. It erupted the way a city erupts when it finally has room to be one. New construction went up in the Eastern Basin. Residential blocks, 2 hospitals, a water reclamation facility that the colony engineers had designed 3 years ago and never been permitted to build. The port was tripled in capacity. The agricultural zones pushed south into the valley that the original settlement planners had surveyed, and then quietly left off the maps to avoid attracting council attention to how much land they actually had. Trade ships that had previously required council clearance to enter the system simply came. Freighters from the independent shipping collectives. Small carriers from species who had been doing quiet, bilateral business with human worlds for years but had never wanted it formalized. They came now. Openly. Because there was no longer anybody whose opinion about their coming was being asked. I visited New Carthage on the 4th month of our silence, for a reason that was partly official and mostly personal. I wanted to see it. I had spent so many years in council chambers defending the idea of places like this that I had almost stopped thinking of them as actual places. New Carthage had been an argument for so long that I had half forgotten it was also a city. It was more than a city by then. It was starting to feel like a home. I walked through the market district on a morning in early autumn. The colony used a 26-hour day based on the planet's natural rotation, and the seasons were their own, not calibrated to anything from Earth. The air smelled like dust and something green and something being cooked over open heat somewhere nearby. Children were running between the stalls. A group of older colonists had set up a makeshift gathering space around a central fountain that had not been there 6 months ago. Someone had built it over the summer, apparently without any particular official sanction, simply because they wanted a fountain, and had the skills and the materials to make one. I sat beside that fountain for a while and listened to the water. A man named Owen Birch, who ran a small repair workshop nearby, recognized me from the news coverage and came over to talk. He was perhaps 60, with the slightly weathered look of someone who had lived outdoors for most of his working life, and he had been on New Carthage for 11 years. "You know," he said, settling onto the bench beside me, with the ease of someone who had never particularly worried about whether he belonged somewhere. "We used to have meetings about the council guidelines. Every quarter. Sit around a table and figure out what we could and couldn't do without triggering a complaint." He shook his head slowly. "Haven't had one of those meetings in 9 months. "How does that feel?" I asked. He thought about it genuinely. The way people think about things when they're not performing a feeling but actually checking on one. "Like taking off boots that were too tight," he said. "You don't realize how much it was hurting until it stops." I thought about that for a long time after I left the fountain. The Council's Intelligence Division had been tracking the changes on New Carthage and across the other 14 human colonies with, I imagined, increasing discomfort. Our own intelligence team shared intercepts when they could, and the picture that emerged from the Council's internal communications was of an institution that had expected to be dealing with a desperate and frightened humanity within 30 days of the walkout, and was instead watching something they had not modeled. A species that got more capable the further it moved from council oversight, not less. The productivity numbers were part of it. Our economic output across the colonial network had increased by 340% in 9 months, partly because we were no longer routing trade through council-approved channels that added time and fees and paperwork, and partly because we were no longer holding investment back, out of concern for council reaction. The independent shipping lanes were thriving. The research programs that had been quietly throttled for years, because certain council members had been uncomfortable with the rate of human technological development, were running at full speed. The Prometheus-class ships were another part of it. They had come out of dry dock and taken up positions across human space with the quiet, unhurried confidence of ships that had been waiting a long time for a reason to move. There were no declarations, no press releases. They were simply there, flying patrol routes and escort missions, and making the quite obvious point, without saying it, that human space had teeth. And then there was the other thing, the thing that surprised me most, even though perhaps it should not have. Other species started talking to us. Not through official channels. Not through the council. Through direct contact. Private messages. Small diplomatic signals. Requests for meetings that were carefully framed as unofficial. The Keth liaison Tessivar, who had called us in the second week of our silence, had not been an isolated case. She had been the first, and she had been nervous. But she had been followed by others who were less nervous, because by month 3 it was clear that the sky had not fallen on humanity, and that the Council had no obvious mechanism to make it fall. I had a conversation with an ambassador from a species called the Elhari, a quiet, precise people who occupied 3 star systems in the outer reach of Council space, on the 5th month. His name was Delvin, and he came to the Meridian not on a diplomatic ship, but on a merchant vessel, listed on the manifest as a trade representative. We talked for 3 hours. The Elhari had been council members for 400 years. In those 400 years, they had had their territorial limits redrawn 11 times, always in directions that reduced rather than expanded their space. They had been assessed economic penalties for resource extraction that other species conducted freely. They had watched their application for a second vote in council proceedings be deferred 47 times across 2 centuries. They had done all of this without walking out of a room, because walking out of a room had not seemed like something that was available to them. Delvin was not angry. He was something quieter than angry, the deep, bone-level tiredness of someone who has accommodated something for so long that accommodation has become a reflex. He told me the history of the Elhari's relationship with the council, the way someone might describe a long illness, not with drama, but with the flat precision of facts that hurt too much to decorate. When he finished, I asked him what the Elhari wanted. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We want what you appear to have found. We are simply not certain what that is exactly." "Neither are we," I told him honestly, "but we're finding out." He nodded slowly. "That may be the most encouraging thing a human has ever said to us." Delvin left on his merchant ship without making any formal commitments, but 2 weeks later, his government quietly contacted Osei's office and requested information on the terms under which humanity was conducting its new bilateral trade agreements. They were not alone. By month 7, 11 separate species had established some form of informal contact with human representatives, either through direct channel or through intermediaries. None of them had publicly broken with the Council. None of them were doing anything that could be called a defection. But the conversations were happening, and they were real, and they were about something that was changing. The Council, meanwhile, was performing urgency. They issued statements. They opened formal proceedings. They convened emergency sessions and passed resolutions. Resolutions declaring humanity's behavior contrary to galactic order. Resolutions demanding humanity return to the table. Resolutions expressing grave concern about the precedent being set. We received the texts of all of them. We read them carefully. We responded to none of them. I want to be honest about something. There were days, during those 9 months, when what I was doing did not feel like strength. There were days when the silence felt fragile rather than deliberate, when I lay awake in my quarters on the Meridian and ran through the failure scenarios with the merciless thoroughness of someone who has spent too many years in diplomacy. What if the Council imposed a blockade? What if they moved militarily against New Carthage? What if our silence was being read not as a strategic choice but as confusion, and they were simply waiting for us to get tired and come back? On one such night, Carter sent me a message that I have read many times since. He wrote, "The thing about a wall is that it does not need to argue. It only needs to stand." I thought about that for a long time. The Veth Dominion made contact in month 8, not through the Council, directly and privately, through a channel that required 3 layers of encryption to access, and was clearly not something they wanted logged anywhere official. The message came from someone identified only as a senior advisor to the Veth Leadership Council, and it contained one sentence: "We would like to understand what humanity wants." I wrote the reply myself and had Osei review it before we sent it. "We want what we have always wanted," I wrote, "to be treated as what we are. We want nothing from the Council at this time. That is, in fact, the entire point." There was a pause of 11 days before the next message arrived. It was slightly longer than the first, and its tone had shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. The tone of someone who has gone and had a conversation they were not expecting to have, and come back altered by it. It said, "The Dominion would like to request a meeting." I looked at those words for a long time. Then I forwarded the message to Osei with one line appended, "They're blinking." She replied within the hour, "Good. Make them wait 2 more weeks before we answer." We waited exactly 2 weeks. Then we replied. The location of the meeting would be New Carthage. The terms would be set by humanity. The agenda would be determined by humanity. There would be no council observer. There would be no record distributed to council archives. The Veth agreed to all of it. They agreed to all of it. I read their confirmation 3 times. Then I put on my jacket, the same one I had put on in the council chamber 14 months ago. On the morning I set down a speech and walked out without a word, and I went to find Carter to tell him. He was on the observation deck, watching the stars the way older officers sometimes do, with the particular quality of attention that has nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with perspective. He turned when I came in. I handed him the tablet with the Veth confirmation on it. He read it. He set it down. He looked at the stars again for a moment. "They're coming to us," he said. Not a question. Just the fact of it, held out in the open air to see how it felt. "They're coming to us," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have thought this was impossible." "My father thought patience was the only strategy," I said. He wasn't wrong. He was just patient about the wrong things. Carter nodded. Outside, the stars held their positions. The Meridian flew on through the quiet between them, carrying its crew toward a meeting that no one in 800 years of Galactic Council history had imagined could happen this way. I did not sleep that night either. But this time it was not because I was afraid. The Veth delegation arrived at New Carthage's orbital station on a gray, overcast morning by the colony's calendar. One of those soft days where the light comes through the clouds without quite breaking them, and everything on the surface looks a little more vivid than usual. Colors slightly brighter against the muted sky. I watched their ship dock from the observation window of the station's main receiving hall. It was a Veth diplomatic vessel, smaller than I expected, and it came in without the ceremonial approach vectors that their ships always used at council events. No slow arc, no formal alignment with the station's axis, no recorded transmission of their insignia. They docked the way a merchant ship docks, efficiently and without performance. I took that as a deliberate signal. They were trying to communicate something before they had said a word. I had chosen the receiving hall deliberately. It was not one of the station's formal meeting rooms, which were designed to project institutional authority and were equipped with all the trappings of official proceedings. Raised platforms, ranked seating, recording equipment built into the walls. The receiving hall was simply a large, well-lit room with chairs and a long table, and windows looking out over the curve of New Carthage below. You could see the eastern basin from here. If the cloud cover was right, you could see the new construction, the housing blocks, the port expansion, the water reclamation towers catching the diffused light. I had chosen it so that any Veth who looked out the window would have to see, without being told to look, what humanity had built in 9 months of not asking permission. The delegation was 3 people. Arbiter Voss was not among them, which told me something about how the Veth were framing this internally. Not as a council proceeding, where Voss would have been the natural representative, but as something else, something without a ready category. The senior delegate was a Veth named Sarah Vallis, who I had seen in council chambers before but never spoken to directly. She was senior enough to indicate that they were taking this seriously, and junior enough to indicate that they were not committing to anything officially. She walked into the receiving hall and stopped at the threshold, the way people stop when a room is slightly different from what they prepared themselves for. Her eyes moved to the windows, to New Carthage below. She looked at it for just a moment longer than she needed to before turning to face me. "Commander Varen," she said. "Ambassador Vallis," I said. "Welcome to New Carthage." There was a careful pause in that, the welcoming to a place they had tried to take from us. I did not make it pointed. I said it the way you say welcome to a guest in your home, warmly, with the quiet confidence of someone on their own ground. We sat down. I had Owen Birch's assistant bring in refreshments, local things, New Carthage produce and drink, nothing imported, and nothing from species who had known to ask what we preferred before we got here. Small choices, all of them. But choices carry weight in rooms like this, and I had been in enough of them to know it. Vallis opened by telling me that the Veth Dominion wanted to express its regret at how Edict 7 Theta had been communicated. I listened. She said the language of the edict had been imprecise, and that several of its provisions had been drafted without adequate consultation. I listened. She said the Dominion believed that humanity's concerns deserved a serious and formal hearing, and that they were prepared to facilitate a return to Council membership on revised terms. She was very good at this. She had the manner of someone making a generous offer, of someone extending something from a position of stability. The language was measured and reasonable, and gave no outward sign of the anxiety I had seen in the Veth's private messages over the past 2 months. I let her finish. I thanked her for the clarity of the Dominion's position, and then I said, in the same even tone she had used, that I wanted to ask her a question before we went any further. She nodded. In the 9 months since we stopped communicating with the Council, I said, has anything in human space collapsed? A brief pause. Not to our knowledge, she said carefully. Have we started any conflicts? I said. No, she said. Have we failed to meet any obligation to any species we have bilateral arrangements with? She looked at me steadily. No. Then I want you to understand something, I said. I kept my voice exactly as even as hers. No anger, no edge. Simply the weight of a fact being placed on a table. The premise of this conversation, that humanity needs to return to the Council, that the correct direction of movement here is back toward the arrangement we left. That premise is not one I accept. We left because the arrangement was not working for us. In the time since we left, we have been working better than we have in 60 years. I paused. I'm not telling you this to be difficult. I'm telling you this because I think it's information that should be part of whatever conversation we're having. Valis was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something in her tone had shifted. Fractionally, the way tones shift when someone decides to stop performing composure and simply have a conversation. What would humanity want, she said, if not a return? And there it was, the question underneath all the other questions. The reason they had traveled to New Carthage on a merchant-sized ship without ceremony and without Voss. I had spent the previous 2 weeks working through this with Osei and Carter, and a team of people who had been thinking very hard about what a new arrangement for humanity might actually look like. Not a return to the Council. Not an open break with it either, which would have created the kind of confrontational dynamic that no one needed. Something else. I told her about the Autonomous Species Accord. The concept was straightforward, and its simplicity was part of its strength. A compact between species who agreed to 3 principles: mutual respect for territorial integrity, non-coercion in trade and diplomacy, and the right of each species to determine its own development pace and direction, without external supervision. No hierarchy, no non-voting observer seats. No provisions that applied to some members and not to others based on how long they had been members. No retroactive designations that allowed one species to strip another of what it had legally built. 11 species had already privately indicated willingness to sign, if such a compact were offered to them. I did not name them to Valis. That was not hers to know. But I said 11, clearly and without qualification, and I watched her process the number. The Council would see this as a competing structure, she said. The Council is welcome to see it however they like, I said. The Council is also welcome to apply for membership, on the same terms as everyone else. Another pause, longer this time. Equal terms, she said carefully. Equal terms, I confirmed. I watched her work through what that meant. Equal terms meant the Veth Dominion, which had been the senior power in the Galactic Council for 2 centuries, would have one voice in the Accord's proceedings. The same as the Elhari, the same as the Keth, the same as humanity. No precedence of membership, no historical seniority. One voice. It was not a hostile offer, it was an honest one. And honesty, in this kind of room, can land harder than any hostile gesture. I need to take this back to the Dominion, Valis said. Of course, I said. She stood. We shook hands. She initiated it, which was the Veth gesture of genuine engagement, rather than formal conclusion. I had read enough about Veth customs to know the difference. I did not show that I noticed it. At the door, she paused and turned back, and for a moment, she looked less like an ambassador and more like a person standing at a threshold. Commander Varen, she said, your delegate seat has been officially suspended pending proceedings. Formally, you are no longer a recognized representative to the Council. I know, I said. And yet, she said. and there was something in her voice that was not quite admiration and not quite frustration, and was perhaps the particular feeling you have when you realize you have been wrong about something for a very long time. Here you are. Here I am, I said. She left. I stood at the window and watched her ship undock and pull away from the station, growing small against the gray-lit sky. Below, New Carthage went about its morning. The markets were opening. The new construction crews were moving. The fountain Owen Birch had told me about, the one no one had formally authorized, was probably running somewhere in the city. Water moving through stone in the middle of a day no one was waiting for permission to live. I pulled out my personal notebook, paper, like my father's habit, because some things you keep, and wrote down one line while the memory was still clear. They came to New Carthage. We did not go to them. I underlined it, not because I needed to remember it, but because it deserved to be underlined. The Autonomous Species Accord was signed on the 47th day after Sarah Vallis's visit to New Carthage, in the same receiving hall with the same view of the Eastern Basin, on a morning when the clouds had finally broken, and the light came through clean and direct and warm on the table where the documents lay. 13 species signed that morning, not 11, 13. 2 had come forward in the final weeks who had not been in contact before, having heard through the quiet channels that something was happening, and deciding, in their own careful ways, that they wanted to be part of it before it was already done. I will not pretend the signing was a dramatic event in the way that people sometimes imagine historic moments to be, full of speeches and visible emotion, and the sense that everyone in the room understood what they were witnessing. It was quieter than that, deliberate. There were moments of formality and moments where delegates simply talked across the table as people who were trying to figure out a common problem together. Tessivar was there, in person now, her harmonic voice filling the room with something that felt like warmth without quite being translatable. Delvin of the Elhari arrived early, and spent the first hour before the signing looking out the window with the expression of someone checking a long-held calculation and finding it comes out right. Osei flew in from Earth 2 days before the signing, and we stayed up late the night before going through every clause and contingency. She had the habit, when she was thinking very hard, of folding and unfolding a small paper square with her hands. Not origami, just movement, her fingers working while her mind was somewhere ahead of the conversation. We had been doing this for months, the two of us, across encrypted channels and secure rooms, and once on a cargo freighter between systems, when the regular diplomatic transport had a mechanical issue, and we had hitched a ride and sat in the cargo bay and worked through the entire structure of the Accord, among crates of agricultural equipment. She asked me, that last night before the signing, whether I was afraid of anything. I thought about it honestly. That we've built something real, I said, and someone will spend the next 100 years trying to make it into the same thing we left. She nodded. She had thought about this too. Then we write it so they can't, she said. Not in the document. Documents can be rewritten. In the practice. In the way we behave from the start. She was right. She was almost always right about the things that mattered most. The Galactic Council issued a formal response to the Accord signing, 6 days after it happened. The statement declared the Accord unrecognized by the instruments of galactic governance and invited all signatory species to reconsider their obligations to the established order. It was the kind of statement that is very long and says very little that is actually actionable, and reading it carefully, you could feel underneath the formal language the specific quality of an institution that has not yet decided what to do, and is buying time with words. 3 council member species formally requested observer status at the Accord within the week of that statement. 2 more followed the week after. The council was not dissolving. I want to be clear about that, because the story is not about the council dissolving. 800 years of institutional history does not simply end because 13 species signed something in a room on a colony world. The council would continue. It would adapt or it would diminish, or it would do both at once, the way old institutions often do. But it would no longer be the only room in the galaxy where decisions were made. And the species who had believed, for generations, that the only way to exist in that room was to be smaller than they were, those species now had somewhere else to be. Arbiter Voss sent a private message to me the day after the signing. I did not respond to it for 3 days. not from coldness but because I wanted to read it carefully several times before I formed a reply. He said that he believed humanity had made a serious error. He said that the structures the Council had built, whatever their imperfections, represented the accumulated effort of centuries to prevent the kind of species-level conflicts that had defined the galaxy before the Council's founding. He said that introducing a competing body without the Council's sanction was, in his view, destabilizing rather than liberating. He was not wrong about all of it. The structures the Council had built had genuinely served some of the purposes he described. The galaxy before the Council had been harder, in ways that were not romantic or admirable. I did not think the Council was simply a villain or that 800 years of history was simply a waste. Things are more complicated than that. I wrote back to him. I wrote that I did not disagree with his account of the Council's origins or its historical function. I wrote that I thought he was a person who genuinely believed in what he was doing and had perhaps never fully considered how it felt to be on the other side of the decisions he made. I wrote that the Accord was not designed to prevent cooperation between species. It was designed to make cooperation possible between equals, rather than between those who decided and those who complied. And I wrote, at the end, that the offer of Accord membership remained open to the Council and to the Dominion, and to any member species who wished to engage on those terms. He did not reply. I had not expected him to, not yet. He would need time. So would many others. On the day after the signing, I walked through New Carthage for the second time. It was warmer than my first visit. The fountain was exactly where Owen had described it, in the center of the market district, water moving through a plain stone basin that someone had clearly built with care and no particular hurry. A group of children were sitting around the edge of it, eating something and arguing about something in the loud, spirited way that children argue when no one is in actual distress. Owen was at his workshop. He recognized me and came out, wiping his hands on a cloth, and asked how the meeting had gone. I told him we had signed something. He asked what it meant in practical terms. I thought about how to explain it simply. It means no one tells New Carthage how big it can get, I said. He nodded. He looked up at the sky, clear now, properly blue, the way it gets when the weather system that comes off the eastern mountains finishes passing through. That fountain, he said, took me and 3 neighbors about 2 weeks to build. Nobody asked us. Nobody told us to. We just thought it belonged there. He looked back at me. That's all most people want, I think. To put something somewhere because it belongs there. I thought about my father, about the mirror and the practiced walk and the 20 years of careful, patient, deliberate goodwill that had never been enough, because it was never meant to be enough. It was meant to be ongoing. It was meant to be a permanent arrangement. We were meant to always be in the process of earning something that was never quite going to be granted. I did not feel angry about that, standing beside Owen Birch's fountain on a warm morning in New Carthage. I felt something quieter than anger, the kind of clarity you arrive at when something you have been carrying for a very long time finally touches the ground. My father had given his life to a table he believed would eventually welcome him fully. I had walked away from that table and found that walking away was not the end of the story. It was, in fact, where the story finally started going somewhere. The following week, back on the Meridian, I started writing the Accord's implementation guidelines with Osei and a rotating team of legal and diplomatic specialists who were, to a person, working with an energy I had not seen in years. There was something in the building of it, the actual construction of a thing that was genuinely new rather than a modification of something old, that made the work feel different, harder in some ways because there was no template, lighter in others because there was no one to ask permission. Sarah Vallis contacted me again, 6 weeks after her visit to New Carthage. The Veth Dominion, she said, was requesting formal consideration of Accord membership. I told her the terms remained what I had described. Equal standing. One voice, she said, after a pause that I imagined involved a great many conversations I was not present for, that the Dominion accepted. I noted it in the notebook. Not the diplomatic record which Nina Holt maintained with her usual precision, the personal notebook. Paper, like my father's habit. Then I turned back to the work on the desk in front of me. There was a great deal of it, and it was the best kind of work. The kind where the outcome was not yet determined, where the shape of what was being built was still emerging, where the people doing the building were doing it because they had chosen to and not because they had been told to. Outside, New Carthage was growing. The Prometheus-class ships were flying. 13 species, 14, counting the Veth, were meeting on equal terms for the first time in centuries. The Council was adapting, however slowly, however reluctantly. The galaxy was not a simpler place than it had been 14 months ago. It was more complicated in some ways, but it was honest in a way it had not been. My father had spent his life asking permission to exist at that table. I had spent one afternoon walking away from it. I had spent the following year building a different table, in a different room, with a different view, where the chairs were not arranged in tiers, and the seats did not come with conditions attached. He would have thought it was impossible. That was the thing about my father. He was brave enough to keep going to the table, year after year, past every humiliation, and every revision, and every new form in which the same old answer arrived. That was a kind of courage. I had inherited it. I had just used it differently. The fountain on New Carthage ran water through plain stone, because 3 neighbors had decided it belonged there. The accord existed because 13 species had decided, quietly and carefully, and without asking the Council's opinion, that something new was allowed to exist. Some doors are not worth knocking on anymore, especially when you have just built your own.